In 1916, at the very beginning of the year, the Ottoman government could congratulate itself on two significant victories. They had repelled a British attack on Baghdad, and they had forced the British evacuation of Gallipoli. These were two significant advantages. Furthermore, they had survived the onslaught of a very, very powerful Russian offensive out of the Caucasus. On the other hand, the empire was in severe jeopardy that it had lost its capacity to continue a war at this level. And at the beginning of 1916, it was really unclear what direction the Ottoman Empire would go. All of these victories had been defensive. The strategic initiative rested with both the Russians and the British. Furthermore, Enver Pasha was a little bit beside himself that Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic in 1923, who was a regimental commander, was lionized among the political classes of the Ottoman Empire for his heroic stand at Gallipoli. And eventually, Ataturk would come out of the war as the most successful of the commanders. He and his field commander, Ismet Pasha, the future Inunu, and the second president of the Republic, established a reputation of being incomparable commanders. That did not sit well with Enver Pasha, and Enver Pasha and Mustafa Kemal, Ataturk, always had a tension between the two. Meanwhile, the Russians were busy. As is inevitable in waging wars against the Russians excel at winter campaigns. And the commander who had been really responsible for the offensive back in 1914 planned a more ambitious one for 1916. His name is N.N. Udovich, and furthermore, he had received reinforcements. On September 24th, 1915, Tsar Nicholas had assumed personal command of the Russian armies facing the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. Not one of Nicky's better decisions. His Grand Duke uncle, Grand Duke Nicholas, was transferred to Tiflis, that is, to the Caucasus front. It was essentially a kick upstairs. On the other hand, the Grand Prince, being a member of the Romanov family, had to be properly supplied with forces, and he arrived in the Caucasus with fresh reinforcements, especially large numbers of Cossack cavalry units. And so the Russian army, by the opening of 1960, was much more powerful than the force that had been faced back in 1914, 1915 in that ill-fated winter campaign ordered by Enver Pasha. On January 7th, which happened to be Christmas Day in the Julian calendar, that is the calendar used by the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russians launched a major offensive. Halil Pasha, the uncle of Enver Pasha, who had rebuilt the Third Army in the Caucasus, didn't expect an attack at all, particularly on Christmas Day. The Russians carried Ottoman positions with no problem, regained a lot of the real estate they had taken back in 1914, and drove the Third Army to the west into Anatolia, and the Second Army south into the regions that would today be known as the Al Jazeera, or to the ancient Romans, Mesopotamia. That would be the borderlands between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq today. The Ottoman army was in full retreat, and it fell back to a series of fortresses. Beyond all expectation, in February of 1916, in blistering winter conditions, the Russians took the city of Erzurum, the most strongly fortified city in all of eastern Anatolia, and the linchpin and base for the Ottoman army operating against the Russians. It was a brilliant campaign. Meanwhile, Russian forces pushed immediately south, aiming for the cities of Mush and Bitlis. Those familiar with the geography of eastern Turkey realize that these are the lifelines connecting the eastern provinces west to Kayseri, Sivas, and ultimately Constantinople. The Russians were in advance everywhere in the opening of 1916. Given the winter conditions and the poor railway capacity, there was very little the Ottoman army could do until the summer of 1916 against the Russians. The ports fell, particularly the crucial port of Trabzon on the Black Sea. Also, the port of Riza. And true to form, the Russians not only moved into these areas, they began building railways. A railway that would go from Batum on the Black Sea to Riza, to Trabzon, to Ankara. And it's clear that the Russians had come into Anatolia to stay, and the plan in 1917 was to march to Ankara, then to the Bosporus, and take Constantinople. Fortunately, the Ottomans got their act together in the summer and were able to stabilize the front. And no small measure, this was owed to, again, Mustafa Kemal, who was now promoted to a corps commander in the Second Army, commanded the 16th Corps that defended Bitlis in August of 1916 and checked the relentless Russian advance. The Russians stalled to build railways, to amass supplies, and to get ready for a new offensive in 1917. That offensive never came. And one wonders what would have happened if the Russians had launched an offensive early in 1917. They could well have reached the Bosporus. But on the old Julian calendar of February 25th, 1917, which is the equivalent of March 7th in the Gregorian calendar, bread riots in Petrograd escalated into a revolution. The Tsar abdicated, and the first Russian Revolution took place. The Russian armies halted in early 1917. There was already discontent and demoralization on the front facing the Germans. And in the Caucasus, Yudovich halted operations. And what happened is the Russian army actually set up Soviets and began to hold officers responsible for incompetence. Discipline began to break down across the Russian lines. The Ottoman army had been miraculously saved. And what was even more important is in April, at the Finland station, when Vladimir Lenin showed up, compliments of Ludendorff and von Hindenburg, who bankrolled the Bolsheviks in gold to seize power in November of 1917, the so-called October Revolution, October 25, according to the Julian calendar. Lenin and Trotsky took power in Petrograd, immediately declared an armistice in early December, and began negotiations with both Germany and Austria-Hungary, as well as the Ottoman Empire, to end the war. And they were willing to make major territorial concessions so long as the Bolsheviks could control the heartland of Russia and carry out the communist revolution. The result was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early March of 1918, in which Russia left the war. This was a godsend to the Ottoman Empire, and it opened up the potential of the redeployment of Ottoman forces to hard-pressed frontiers on the Suez and in Iraq against the British. But Enver Pasha and most of the members of the cabinet in Constantinople, one of the major exceptions was actually Jamil Pasha, who was the governor general of Syria and had been the secretary of the Navy. Most of them saw 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, as a great opportunity to pick up real estate from the Russians in the Caucasus. But there were other fronts that needed attention. And Enver Pasha would eventually overrule these concerns and commit Ottoman forces into the Caucasus. Well, what were the other frontiers? Obviously, the British. One was the Suez. As the Russian army pushed its way into Anatolia, if you can believe it, in 1916, another offensive was planned across the Suez. This offensive that was based in Gaza and directed by Jamil Pasha, of course, did not go very well. The army did cross the frontier thanks to German logistics and reached the canal in January and March of 1916. But again, the Ottomans could not force the defenses of the canal. And the result is the operation stalled. In August, there was a significant battle fought in the Sinai, largely by Anzac forces at Romani. And eventually, the Ottoman army had to pull back into Syria and defend a set of fortifications running from Gaza on the coast out toward the desert to the famous wells of Beersheba. And the Ottoman army now in the Levant was on the defensive. It also had faced serious opposition in Syria that had been building since 1915, 1916, among the urban populations in Damascus and Beirut and the lesser cities of Syria at the exactions and the demands being made by the Ottoman army. Unknown to the Ottomans, in July of 1917, a new commander showed up to take over command from Sir Archibald Murray, who had been conducting the defense of the Suez. His name would be Sir Edmund Allenby, and he would eventually change the entire nature of the front in the Levant. There was also another significant event that took place in the summer of 1916, which at first did not seem that important. And that involved the city of Mecca. Mecca, of course, is the center of the Islamic world. The protection of the pilgrimage routes is all important. The Kaaba commands the loyalty of every pious Muslim who should undertake a Hajj. That is a pilgrimage to see the sacred places. The Ottoman Sultan at the time, Mehmed V, while he didn't stress his position as caliph, did command the loyalty of many of his subjects by virtue that he was the caliph. And the control of Mecca was all important. Now, given the pragmatism of the Ottomans, they had invested power in the Najd, that is the section of Arabia that where Mecca and Medina are located, to the local ruler. And that happened to be Hussein ibn Ali of the Hashemite family that claimed his descent from the Prophet. He held the title Emir and Sharif. He was guardian of the holy places. It was his tribesmen that protected pilgrims that left Medina, where the rail line stopped, and made their way to Mecca. He also had control over the port of Jeddah on the Red Sea, which is where many pilgrims landed, and also was the main port for supplying the population in the city of Mecca, which is in a relatively small oasis and would need imports. Now, Hussein had been playing a double game ever since 1914. The British High Command in Cairo wanted to win him over and carry out a major Arab revolt that would lead to massive defections into the Ottoman army and win over the Arab provinces. Sir Archibald Murray, who was in charge of operations in 1915, 1916, came up with all sorts of plans, and Hussein was taking an enormous subsidy paid in gold or Maria Theresa silver thalers, he wouldn't take paper, to supply money to his tribesmen. And this British subsidy was very important because the war had disrupted the pilgrimage route a great deal, and that meant the loss of income for all of the tribes as well as the city of Mecca. Now, Jamil Pasha, who was the governor general in Syria, as well as Enver Pasha in Constantinople, were not unaware of the importance of Hussein or his dealings with the British. Hussein had two important sons, Abdul, the older one, who eventually would become the king of the country we now know as Jordan, and the younger one, Faisal, who was briefly king in Syria. Both of these sons were set out on diplomatic missions. While one son would be talking to the British in Cairo, the other would be in Constantinople or Damascus talking to the Ottomans. Jamil Pasha was very, very skeptical about the loyalty of Hussein, and with good reason, but the Ottomans also provided their sweeteners to buy the loyalty of Hussein. And through the whole course of the first 2.5 years of the war, Hussein really switched from one side to the other. What should he do? And finally, it was probably British money, as well as the fact that Jeddah is where all the food came in, that inclined him to go over to the British side. And sometime in June of 1916, it's not clear, he raised a revolt against the Ottomans in the name of jihad, in the name of the Prophet, with the green banners of the Prophet. In other words, using the same appeals that were announced back on November 11th, 1914, when the Ottoman Sultan had commanded a jihad. Well, this British-backed jihad really didn't go anywhere. It never took Medina. It never really seriously threatened the railway system. And above all, most of the Arabs pretty much ignored it. Those who were in Ottoman military units more or less stay loyal to their units. There were some defections by officers. The reason the Arab revolt has gotten so much play is because of a British officer seconded to the diplomatic corps named T.E. Lawrence. He made it important. And he made it important largely for his own purposes. Lawrence had made contact with the older son, Abdul, at Jeddah, and he was able to magnify the importance of the Arab revolt and help encourage it by arguing that if the British did not support the Arab revolt, the French would. You know, the British don't like that idea. I know they're allies, but after all, they are French, and the British and French have often been rivals. And he manipulated the political situation to give the impression that he had a lot more pull with the Arabs than he did. His adventures were eventually published in 1926 in the so-called Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which is a marvelous piece of fiction masquerading as memoirs. Lawrence really had very, very little influence over what Hussein was doing. He was apparently involved in the capture of Aqaba in 1917, the only significant event in the Arab revolt that really was just a nuisance value to the Ottomans. And he did come to the attention of Allenby, and Allenby thought he might be useful and gave him a lot of money to raise the irregular mounted Camel Corps, which was to operate on the right flank, the desert flank of the British Army that would invade Palestine and take Jerusalem on December 9th, 1917. And it's really unclear exactly what that Camel Corps did. It never numbered more than 4,000. The allegation, and this was presented in the Seven Pillars of Wisdom and then was reproduced on the 1962 epic film, that this Camel Corps actually took the city of Damascus after the Battle of Megiddo is just pure fiction. It was probably occupied by an Australian cavalry unit. Now, the reason that Lawrence got so much play is really during 1919, 1920 in the Versailles Conference. First, the French played up his successes and made claims that the Arab revolt had actually taken Damascus, and that would discredit Allenby, and they hated Allenby because he took Jerusalem and went and handed it over to the French. And then Allenby decided that Lawrence would be useful as a PR move to indicate that it was really the Arabs who took Damascus and the French shouldn't get their mandate there. And this just built up and Lawrence went on to publish his book and Fame, and the movie was made. The Arab revolt, however, did have some long-term significance. It elevated the Hashemite family to the position that they would be the major spokesman for the various Arabic populations in the conferences that would occur after the partition of the Ottoman Empire, but we'll deal with that at a later date in a future lecture. Meanwhile, in Egypt, when Allenby took command, in the summer of 1917, most of the best forces were actually pulled out of Egypt and sent to the Western Front. Allenby had been posted to Egypt by Kitchener because Kitchener hated Allenby. Allenby, for instance, criticized such obvious blunders like frontal assaults against trenches and machine gun, and argued that maybe it's a good idea to attack where the enemy isn't, like flanking movements, but that he was essentially posted to Egypt just to get him off the Western Front. And then most of his best forces were taken from him. And in the summer of 1917, besides carrying out some brilliant deceptions against Jamil Pasha and the Ottoman army in Syria, he literally rebuilt the British force. And the overwhelming number of them were Commonwealth soldiers, particularly Australians, and above all, Indian soldiers from British India. Many of them Punjabi Muslims. And that was the same situation in the Iraq front in Basra, where the British Army also composed overwhelmingly of Indian soldiers. A testimony to the success of the British Army in India. These men served loyally. And if you just think of it for a moment, the British essentially attacked the Caliphate with a largely Muslim army and got away with it. It's really a quite stunning achievement, and Allenby gets a lot of credit for that success. Well, the British Army crossed the Sinai and at Gaza broke the deadlock on November 1st, 2nd, 1917, with a dramatic charge on Beersheba. Allenby feinted to Gaza and flanked on the desert with his Australian light horse, and that charge was brilliantly recreated in an Australian movie in 1987 called the Light Horseman, and they took Jerusalem on December 9th, 1917, and the front in Palestine was collapsing. Meanwhile, the British had taken Baghdad earlier in the year, in March, under the command of Sir Frederick Stanley Maude, another veteran soldier from the British Indian Army, and they were pushing up to Mosul. So both Mosul and Damascus, that his great capitals of the Caliphate were threatened, and invariably that British army would continue until it would enter Asia Minor. And the question comes up, why didn't the Ottoman state redeploy its forces in early 1918 to meet these two threats? It was obvious that the British were moving in the direction of that heartland, Anatolia, which was so important to the Ottoman state at this point. Well, the reason for that is the sudden collapse of the Russian Empire. And the same reasoning was behind Enver Pasha and many of the cabinet members and the senior officers, as was with the German general staff and the two unnamed dictators of Germany, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The suffering of the First World War, and I stressed that at the start of this group of lectures, was so much that compensation was needed for the suffering. The Ottoman Empire suffered as much, or even perhaps more in some ways, than Germany and Austria-Hungary. And the terrible truth about war, and to learn that one only needs to go back to the first great military historian, Thucydides, is one never wins the war you enter. And whatever the aims were at the start of the war in 1914, when they bombed those Russian ports, they had changed by early 1918, when the Russians signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and agreed to hand over vast sections, western sections of the Russian Empire, and the scramble was on who would get what. In this case, the Ottomans saw compensation for the suffering and the losses, the starvation that was widespread in 1916 and 17 by major conquests in the East. And it's understandable, as the British were moving slowly into Syria, moving into Iraq, that Enver Pasha committed the bulk of his forces on that northeastern front of the Caucasus. And the Ottoman army performed well. His uncle Halil Pasha, commander of the Third Army, recovered the real estate lost in Anatolia, Erzurum, Trabzon. They went on the offensive and retook vital provinces that had been signed away to the Russians back in 1878. That included the cities of Kars, the port of Batum, and Ardahan. But beyond that, the expectation was we'll cross the Caucasus and recover all of those areas inhabited by Muslim populations that had once been part of the Ottoman Empire going back to the Treaty of 1726. And an aspiration of the armies of Suleiman the Magnificent and Selim the Grim. So what happened is, by the opening of 1918, the Third Army received the bulk of the forces, the best commanders, and they would eventually achieve a spectacular victory by capturing the city of Baku in September of 1918. Now, one of the other aspects of this campaign is to supplement the Ottoman army and the fact that it just didn't have the population to maintain conscription. Large numbers of tribesmen were hired. These included Chechens, they included Kurds, all sorts of Muslim minorities that had been under Russian rule, and they were consolidated into something called the Army of Islam. And the fighting in the Caucasus was unbelievably brutal. It saw the ethnic wars between Armenians and Georgians on one side, various Muslims on another. Atrocities and massacres were conducted by both sides. It added to the tragedy of the ethnic cleansing and the breakdown of the traditional millet system that had worked so well in the Ottoman Empire. Nonetheless, Enver Pasha wanted the compensation of those areas. Ironically, he actually came into conflict with the Germans over it, because the Germans had the same desire to take those oil fields. And the Germans had the same desire to consolidate conquests in the East. That's why Ludendorff maintained nearly 1 million German soldiers in Western Russia. When he launched his great offensive in March of 1918, that was supposed to end the war, the great Kaiserschlacht, the Second Battle of the Marne, and in part it faltered because so many forces were still in Russia and were not committed to the Western Front to crush the French and British before the Americans arrived. And you can't fault Enver Pasha on this one. He's made some incredible strategic blunders. Certainly in 1914 and 15, he never appreciated Ataturk, but nonetheless, on this one you can understand. The entire political classes in Constantinople saw that victory in Russia would give them the resources to turn around and meet the British on equal terms. The problem was timing. They never consolidated those Russian conquests soon enough to face two unexpected threats, collapses that occurred in September of 1918 that dramatically changed the war and literally led to almost immediate Ottoman capitulation. The first collapse came in a completely unexpected quarter. This is usually called the Salonika Front. Salonika, that great city in northern Greece, which had fallen to the Greeks back in November of 1912, and actually the hometown of Mustafa Kemal. You recall that the Germans and Austrians had launched an offensive to knock out Serbia back in 1916 after the collapse of the British expedition in Gallipoli. And the Ottomans and Bulgarians had joined into the war, and the Serbian army was essentially driven out of Serbia. It relocated to the island of Corfu and was eventually reconstituted in northern Greece as part of a mixed allied force to hold the Central Powers from entering Greece. The king in Greece, Constantine, was actually pro-German, but the Greek cabinet and the majority of the Greek population were in favor of the Entente, and the prime minister, Venizelos, actually set up a counter-government in Salonika, and eventually Constantine was forced to abdicate, and Greece entered the war as a full belligerent on the side of the Entente powers. The result was you had this very, very peculiar secondary front where you sent all the soldiers that, well, you didn't really know what to do with them. They were a real hodgepodge of Russians, deserters from the Austro-Hungarian army trained by Russians. The French sent in their colonial forces, the Senegalese, the reconstituted Serbian army, and the Salonika front had just stabilized. It was largely held by Bulgarians and second-tier Ottoman forces. And in early 1918, Enver Pasha had stripped all of the military forces in and around Constantinople and set them east in the great drive to capture the Caucasus and ultimately Baku. Well, completely by surprise, the Allied army in Salonika was reorganized and brought into excellent condition by the overall French commander, Louis Franchet Desperey. Pulled together these disparate forces and built the core of his army around a strike force of the Serbian army, who had every incentive to fight, and his colonial Senegalese forces, who were superb infantry, especially handling the difficult terrain of northern Greece. And he was supported by the British forces, mostly Commonwealth and Greek forces, and in early September planned a very, very bold offensive. It opened up in the second week of September, and to everyone's surprise, it overran Bulgarian positions in no time. Within 10 days, the entire front collapsed. The Bulgarian and Ottoman armies were sent reeling, and the Allied army took a beeline up the Vardar, liberated Belgrade, and entered the middle Danube. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire began to break up into a series of revolutions. Bulgaria made an effort to defend Sofia. King Ferdinand thought better of it, and on October 3rd, 1918, he surrendered and abdicated, and Bulgaria left the war. Well, the British army hooked a strong right and made an advance on Constantinople, and it was clear the city couldn't be defended. The next day after Bulgaria surrendered, Enver Pasha resigned as war minister. Soon afterwards, by the 12th, the entire cabinet had resigned. The then reigning Sultan met with the 6th, summoned a new cabinet, and hastily looked for someone to negotiate with the Allies to come to terms. He may have lost the war, but perhaps he can save his throne. And they dredged out Sir Charles Townshend, who had surrendered at Kut, who was at that point in gilded captivity in the city of Kastamonu. He came and aboard the British battleship, the Agamemnon, on October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the instruments of surrender known as the Armistice of Mudas. At the same time that the Allied forces broke out of Greece, the situation in Syria collapsed. The Sultan had brought in the unbeatable team of Otto Lehmann von Sanders and Mustafa Kemal to reorganize the forces in Syria to check the advances of Allenby after he had taken Jerusalem. And the fighting climaxed in a great battle at Megiddo. Again in September, at about the same time, the front fell in Salonika. By September 25th, Allenby had broken through the defenses in what would be called northern Palestine, centered on Megiddo. And this time, he fainted in the desert and came up the coast. The entire Ottoman army collapsed. Damascus was occupied, as I said, probably by Australian units rather than by the Mounted Camel Corps. And the next objective was Aleppo, and then from there, Asia Minor. And as the Ottoman army fell back in disarray, they received the news that the state had surrendered, that the armistice of Mudas had been concluded. And the day after the armistice, a telegram had come through. Lehman von Saunders summons his officers and says, "It's over," bids farewell to his Ottoman officers, whom he came to respect and appreciate so much, and left for Constantinople. On November 12th, 1918, under orders from the Sultan, Mustafa Kemal, who had been left in charge of the Ottoman forces in Syria, the so-called Yildirim, or Thunderbolt field army, disbanded his soldiers. It told them the war was over and to go home. But he also told them to keep their weapons, because he had a great suspicion of the so-called English gentlemen who had signed that armistice, and he had good reason to be suspicious.